Greeting to all attendees and welcome to the fourth session of the Islamic History and Thought lecture series organized by the Institute of Ismaili Studies. So if you have missed the previous lectures of the series by Dr. Mathieu Thierrier, Dr. Wissam Halawi, and Dr. Edmund Hayes, or if you wish to see them again, they have been recorded and they're now available on the website of the IAS or on the newly created YouTube channel of the IAS. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Salimeh Maghsoudlou, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University. Dr. Maghsoudlou specializes in classical and post-classical periods of medieval Islam, with a focus on Islamic thought, cultural history, and development of scholarly disciplines. Her research explores the interrelationships of Sufism, theology, and philosophy, and the social implications of scholarly practices. She's currently writing as her first monograph, tentatively titled Scholars on the Gallows, the Social, Juridical, and Intellectual History of Apostasy in Medieval Islam. Dr. Maghsoudlou holds a PhD in Islamic Studies from the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, and her dissertation on Aïd al-Qudat al-Hamadani, which she will talk about today, was awarded the best dissertation of the year 2016 on a topic of Iranian studies by the Foundation for Iranian Studies. So the lecture will last for about 30 to 45 minutes and will be followed by a discussion with Dr. Saner and myself. Dr. Saner, who kindly accepted to take part in this session, is an associate professor in Islamic history at the Oriental Institute of the University of Oxford. And he is particularly interested in the history of religious minorities in the Islamic world, as well as in the histories of conversions. During the lecture and discussion, the public is strongly encouraged to send their question in writing through the Q&A option at the bottom of the control panel. And as time allows, I will convey as much of your questions to the speaker. I will now give the floor to Salimeh. Welcome, Salimeh.
Thanks, Forrest. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you, Dr. Zoner, for accepting to be a part of this this lecture. I'm going to share my my screen because I have a let me see if I can, because I have a PowerPoint. Let me see if I can find the button. A scholar's apostasy estate. Medieval historian tell us that on May 14th of the year 1131, a man was executed in Hamadan, a city west of today Iran. They also tell us about another young man who was either killed, executed, or led to death. The circumstances remain mysterious. In the citadel of Aleppo in today's Syria, on the 9th of July, on 29th of July of the year 1191. The first man, the one who was executed in Hamadan, was named Aïd al-Qudat al-Hamadani. The second man, the one who was led to death in Aleppo, was Shahabuddin as-Suhrawardi. They were both in their 30s, and they were rising stars in the scholarly circles of their cities, and they died as a consequence of the accusations that resulted in their condemnation as apostate. These two instances of brutal death are among the most famous cases of a phenomenon that, for lack of a better word, I call scholarly apostasy in pre-modern Islam. By scholarly apostasy, I mean those recorded instances when a scholar, an alim, following the accusation of a doctrinal rift with some basic core Islamic tenets, was judged as no longer Muslim by the juridical body of an Islamic society. The condemnation could result in forfeiting the fundamental rights that came with the status of being a Muslim, including the right to live, to access property and possessions, and to leave behind inheritance. The final upshot was that the scholar not only would lose prestige and status along with his material possessions, but he would also be executed and thus lose life. This phenomenon, I find when I was searching my book, I found that this phenomenon, executing a scholar for charge of apostasy, was very thought-provoking because mainly it contrasts with the social values that are associated with the status of a scholar in pre-modern Muslim societies. The image that historical sources project about the scholar is that of an eminent person, a pillar of the society who's equally respected by the elite and the common people, and therefore it is the opposite of what we see in the case of an executed scholar who's humiliated in the worst way. So therefore, when we encounter in historiographical sources such accounts as these two ones that I just enumerated, where a scholar is not only accused of apostasy, but also executed because of it, we're triggered to pause and ask why. What went wrong with these persons and the societies they lived in so that this ubiquitous paradigm, the paradigm of a reverent person, became reversed? And how much of this reversal is a product of our historiographical sources and the narratives that they crafted out of these singular incidences? In order to understand this phenomenon, I suggest we focus on three areas of scholarly apostasy as a social phenomenon. These three entities are the scholar, the state, and the juridical institution. To have a deeper understanding of this phenomenon, I will then focus on one juridical particularity of the scholarly apostasy that would shed light on its mechanism in whole. So then I will turn to the historiographical tradition, if I have time, I hope we have time, and the way they conjured up specific narratives of apostasy and martyrdom by using the examples of Al-Hamadani and Sahrawardi. So let's begin with who was a scholar in 12th century BC in any given Islamic society. It is not easy to answer this question because the ulama were, the persons that we lump together under the rubric of ulama, they didn't constitute a social class. They were comprised of heterogeneous groups of people who initially hailed from all layers of society. They hold all types of professions to gain their livelihood. They lived in various kinds of economic situations, and they maintained variegated relationships with the military and the ruling elite. So scholars could be poor, they could be rich, they could be in the court of sultans and caliphs. In that case, they would receive generous monthly stipends, or they would prefer to maintain a distance from political authorities and gain their lives by farming, by trade, by becoming tutors to wealthy families. The one thing, nonetheless, that they all shared, despite the disparity of their social profiles, is that all of them claim their mastery of the disciplines of knowledge as a constituent part of their social identity. And I think this is what unites these disparate groups of persons. The fact that they self-identified as scholars created a certain kind of homogeneity among them and distinguished them from the rest of the population. The second element is the state. The concept of state in reference to the entities that governed over pre-modern Islamic societies poses another problem. The strongest critique of the concept of the Islamic state, whether there was such a thing as an Islamic state, comes from Wael Haller in his book, Impossible State. Haller postulated that the modern state's genealogy is exclusively European. Here he prefers to speak of paradigmatic Islamic governance instead of state, precisely because the ultimate sovereign in the Islamic community is considered to be God, and therefore there can be no state without its own sovereignty. Therefore, in Allah's understanding, there never was an Islamic state, even during the time when Islamic empires were at the height of their power. In this interpretation, the Sharia, in Halakh argues that the Sharia is an overarching moral will, the legislative power that stands above any other institutional power, including the juridical and executive powers. Therefore, there can be no separation of the juridical, legislative, and executive powers that are necessary to make a state. In Halakh's analysis, Islamic polities were ruled by what he calls executive sultanism, and therefore judged by any standard definition of what the modern state represents. The concept of the Islamic state is an oxymoron in itself. So Halakh's thesis have been criticized a lot, actually. Its major characteristic, Halakh himself admits, is that it is a moral, and I should add to it, a philosophical reflection. It is not abstracted from the historical study of the particular societies that have been running, of the societal forces that have been running the specific Islamic societies. So let's say Baghdad during the time of Al-Muqtadir, or Al-Mustashir, or the Cairo of the Fatimid Caliphate. It is not based on sociology. In other words, Halakh's critique of the concept of the Islamic state is not based on sociological criteria. And this is where his thesis collides with the historical evidence that once examined and passed through sociological lenses confirm the existence of an entity that today we can readily identify as a state. Marina Rostov, for example, she has shown that even by referring to a strict modern conceptualization that comes from Max Weber, Islamic ruling and an Islamic ruling entity such as the Fatimid Caliphate can be rightly considered as a state. She did that by studying the Arabic documents from the Cairo Geniza, and she showed that all the characteristics of this state enumerated by Max Weber, the sociologist, can all be applied to the Fatimid Caliphate. Here is how Max Weber defined the state. The state has a compulsory character. Which means that someone cannot opt out of the state. It has a centralized government. It attempts at monopoly over the legitimate use of coercion, and it has a defined territory. So, lots of experts like Patricia Krone and others have argued, the question with regard to pre-modern Islamic societies is less whether they were states or not, as to whether they were strong states or not. Because even a quick look at the historical sources confirm that most of the dynasties that gained power after the fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate put in place a running bureaucracy. They had a functioning taxation system. They managed the trade. They tried to establish and maintain agricultural infrastructure, and they also put upon themselves to provide security for their population, even if they failed at it from time to time. The power of this state actually was usually undermined by two of its main assets, which were the military and the powerful households. So in times of turbulence, the military and powerful households could break away from the state and act as autonomous agents in the society. They could actually, and here I'm focusing more on powerful households, because it seems to me that they hold a firm grip over religious practices and institutions and religious institutions, and they could easily incentivize rulers or highly ranked bureaucrats in leading campaigns against scholars with whom they disagreed. This is something that we rarely see in narrative sources, but when they appear, we see with how much force persons from powerful households, they led their campaigns, and they arrived to their desire, which was, for example, taking down this scholar, taking down that one. Examples of such powerful households, for example, with regard to Isfahan, a city in the center of Iran during the time of Seljuqid, are the Khojandis of Isfahan, the Sa'ids, the Khatibis, and these are David Durand-Guedy has studied specifically the Khojandis and the role that they had, the role that they played in interfering with the affairs of Seljuqid sultans. They were actually the Khojandis. They were Khorasanis. They were brought back. Their ancestor was brought back to Isfahan by the Vizier Nizam al-Mulk. He was settled there, and his influence. So he founded a family. The influence of the family grew over generations, and they had the monopoly over positions of power. They were enemies, arch enemies of the Nizaris of Alamut. And thanks to Durand-Guedy's research, we know that it were the Khojandis, with the help of other Khorasani families of Isfahan, who led the anti-Ismaili pogrom of the year 494 or 1101 of the Common Era, when the huge number of people were massacred in a state of anarchy because of being suspected to be loyal to the Nizari cause. It was not actually something that the Seljuk state could do it by itself. So one advantage of basing our understanding on this Weberian conceptualization of a state is that it allows us to see better the way apostasy was handled as a matter of sociological concern. In a famous lecture, Max Weber said that a state is a human community that claims the monopoly of legitimate use of physical force within a given society. I underline here the word legitimate because I'm going to argue that the use of force or violence in case of apostasy, say executing al-Hamadani or imprisoning Sohrawardi, was legitimized by the state that carried it out. And this legitimization was done by the juridical institution, which is the third element that makes possible the existence of apostasy. So in my argument, apostasy was not the same thing as killing someone for just religious zeal. It was just another social institution. So it was the work of juridical body that legalized the whole process of apostasy and took it from the level of mere personal quarrels to a fully fledged legal battle where an individual would legally and legitimately face ostracization, excommunication, and corporeal punishment. The juridical body could be comprised of one or several experts of Islamic law. They could be faqih, mufti, qadi, all those who provided juridical counsel to the ruler and high administrators. Members of the administration, like viziers, the heads of the diwan, were also present during the hearings, and they could influence the process of adjudication. The final decision on the apostasy of a scholar usually came from the highest legal expert or a cohort of legal experts. If the final verdict was that the person was an apostate and should be put to death, the sentence was not always carried out right away because what we usually see in historiographical sources is that the verdict per se could only have an executive value if it were ratified by the highest political authority of the city or dynasty. So it could be, it could wait for months for the caliph, the sultan, or the vizier to be ratified. It is in this part, in the heart of the juridical procedure, that political alliances played out, and legal experts and highly ranked administrators became complicit in taking down the scholar. The fact that the juridical procedure was influenced by political partisanship is completely understandable. Most of the juridical experts were not only allied with administrators, but they were also economically tied to them as officially appointed functionaries whose salaries came directly from the state treasuries. Legal experts and scholars received different types of income from the state depending on the services that they provided. To give you just one example, we have the example of a monthly stipend called mushahara that they received from the state treasury. Political absenteeism actually was quite rare, to the point that when a scholar stayed out of the sphere of daily politics, it was mentioned in biographical dictionaries. But this means that the scholar himself was wealthy enough or had a very generous family inheritance that allowed him to afford to stay to only rely on his own. One practical outcome of the ties between the juridical and executive institutions is that even if it is far-fetched to posit the existence of a policy-led general jurisdiction of apostasy for all the pre-modern Islamic states, it is true that certain political, doctrinal, general agendas that were backed by the states shaped the way apostasy was juridically handled, conceived and handled. This specifically happened during the Mihna. So Mihna, which means which in Arabic means trial or testing, refers to a period of doctrinal inquisition that the Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun started 4 months before his death in 833. Inquisition continued under his two immediate successors and lasted for about 16 years until it was abolished by Al-Mutawakkil. As a doctrinal phenomenon, it targeted only scholars who were part of the juridical body, so qadis and witnesses. So during this process, qadis and witnesses, they were brought to the presence of the caliph or other high officials, and they were asked if they believed that the Quran is as God's speech is created or not. If they said that the Quran is created, they were safe. If they refused to say so, they were persecuted. So as a doctrine, Mihna aimed at establishing the exclusive eternity of God. But there are possible hypotheses as to why Al-Ma'mun decided to start such an inquisition, which had far-reaching political implications. What interests me here is how Mihna shaped the historiography of a scholarly apostasy. There's no doubt that Mihna left a huge impact on the collective memory of the Sunni scholars who wrote about themselves and about those who either approved or resisted the Mihna. Mathieu Tillet, who's a professor of history at Paris-Sorbonne, has discussed how Mihna influenced the rewriting of the history of qadiship and judicature. And according to him, there was a deliberate neglect with regard to pre-Mihna juridical literature, to the point that there was no effort to preserve them, which then led to them falling into oblivion. And this, in consequence, amounted to the composition of new sources about the qadis. This whole process amounted to a certain rewriting of the history of Islamic judicature. So why is that? Because, well, qadis were highly implicated in encouraging caliphs and implementing the pro-Mihna policies. So Mihna is one of the most polarizing issues that made Sunni scholars oppose each other and set the tone for how scholarly apostasy became conceptualized by the Sunni scholars themselves. Most importantly, what it did was to create two prototypes out of different individuals who either opposed the Mihna or supported it. These two prototypes are that of the martyr and that of the apostate. The narratives that were created around these two prototypes, martyrdom or apostasy, then became prominent in the historiography of a scholarly apostasy. To illustrate what I mean, I suggest to see how two persons who had opposing stance with regard to the issue of Quran create were portrayed by our medieval sources. The person who approved the Quran create, one of the person who approved the Quran create was Bishr al-Marisi, who died in 833. Bishr is said to have suffered persecution during the rule of Ibrahim al-Mahdi in the aftermath of the civil war between al-Mamun and al-Amin, the two brothers, Harun al-Rashid's sons. He was reportedly required to make a public recantation of some of his doctrines, but in Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi's biographical dictionary, which is one of the fundamental sources for see how scholars conceived themselves and wrote about themselves, Bishr is called Zandir, apostate, by his own mother in the course of an anecdote. And this blunt use of this harsh terminology contrasts with the ways the other prototype, the martyr, is pictured. So the opposite example is that of Ahmad ibn Nasr al-Khuzai, who was executed in 846. He opposed the Quran create. He led a rebellion against the Abbasid Caliph al-Wathiq, and he was executed by him in the caliphal court. But the way that Khatib actually frames his execution is that he uses the term qutla. He was murdered. He was never called a mulhid, a zandiq, or any other degrading title. His glorification in Khatib al-Baghdadi veers into absurdity as we read anecdote after anecdote where his severed head actually after execution recited the Quran for months. Another policy-led general agenda that hugely influenced the way scholarly apostasy was juridically handled was the anti-Ismailism of the Abbasid Caliph in territories that were either directly under their reign or were governed by other dynasties that pledged allegiance to them, like the Ghaznavids or the Seljuks, who reigned over Iran. Al-Hamadani, for example, he was accused of being Ismaili. The implementation of anti-Ismaili policy of the Abbasid caliphs took shape over time. It didn't have an immediate effect. Someone could be accused of being an Ismaili, but he could stay safe. So it depended on the example. One of the examples is the last vizier of the Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna. He was Hassanak. Hassanak was accused of being an apostate by the Abbasid Caliph Al-Qadir, but he was executed 9 years after the initial accusations were issued. So such policies became the driving force in first creating the possibility for an atmosphere of general suspicion where accusations of apostasy would be utilized as means of revenge. Once there was such general atmosphere, then the number of accusations could easily increase, and the possibility that some of the accusations could end up in violent legal penalties was high. There's one crucial question about the juridical dimension of apostasy that needs particular attention, and that is the type of court of law that handled the scholarly apostasy. The question is raised because of the plurality of the Islamic forms of justice. So we have the direct justice of the sovereign, which is called the mazalim or nazar al-mazalim. We have the qadi court, and then we have the police, the shehna, who could have, adjudicate and punish people. But well, the shehna, there's no evidence that the shehna or the police interfered in matters of such doctrinal importance. But in fact, my conclusion is that if the accused person was a scholar of high stature, the juridical procedure seems to be above this division of Islamic justice system. So assemblies of qadis and other legal experts alongside high officials would hear the accused person and deliberate the case And as I said, the case, the final decision was reached either by the highest legal expert, or who presided over the session, and then the process of adjudication could drag over years and months, and as we have it, for example, in the case of Al-Hallaj. So the presence of the state and the juridical institutions that represent the state are the determining factors that differentiate between apostasy as a legal matter that required juridical action and accusation of apostasy, which could hypothetically not amount to the intervention of the state. Accusations remains most of the time a matter of personal conflict among individuals. And we have numerous examples of these types of accusations in our sources. It seems that in those cases, it was the willfulness of the accuser that pushed to the end the pursuit of juridical procedure. We have an example of this in a story that is told by the Ghaznavid historian Al-Utbi, he was a scribe during the Ghaznavid dynasty in the Ghaznavid courts. And Al-Utbi tells the story of a quarrel between the Karami, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Mamshad, and the Hanafite Qadi, Abu Ala as-Sa'id, who was the chief of the Ashab al-Rai in Khorasan. So they both accused each other of some doctrines that could be conducive to apostasy. When the Sultan ordered the chief Qadi to adjudicate among them, and an assembly with all the witnesses was gathered, Abu Bakr Mamshad, who had forged a legal document to accuse the Qadi Abu Ala, dropped the case, and he offered reconciliations. So the chief Qadi then gave a very precautious report to the Sultan to save the face of both the scholars. But how did the juridical procedure start? Well, it began with a document that is called the Mahdar. The Mahdar is not unknown in theories of Islamic law, but its unknown nature in historical studies has been such that it has caused confused interpretations and misjudgments. To give you an example, a contemporary scholar who studied Ayn al-Qudat al-Hamadani's execution identified the Mahdar that is mentioned about him as the infamous Para-Sharia Nazar al-Mazalim. So a contemporary scholar identified the document with the court of law, and he, based on this misinterpretation, this contemporary scholar said that the court that convicted al-Hamadani was not a Shari court, and was therefore not designed to decide matters of theology or law. Well, this is completely false, actually. A glimpse at our sources determined that people during the Middle Ages were busy writing mahdar for or against each other's beliefs all the time, not only elite, but also the common people. Writing mahdar about someone's faith was relatively common, It was a very relatively common practice, to the point that models of mahdar survived in scribal manuals. For example, in Dastur-e-Dabiri, which is the oldest known scribal manual in Persian, the author, Al-Mihni, provides two models of mahdar. One is about a person's righteous belief, and the other is on a person's heresy. Mahdar was not a document that a typical scribe working in a state chancery would write. So the political authorities in charge of regulating state affairs would not usually issue mahdar, but they would receive mahdars. In the story of as-Sohrawardi, for example, the scholars of Aleppo wrote a mahdar about as-Sohrawardi's heresy. They sent it to Saladin, who was the highest political authority of the Ayyubids, and Ibn Abi Usaybiyah, who reported the story and who probably saw the mahdar itself, quotes a few words from it. So it says, if this man, meaning Sohrawardi, stays alive, he would corrupt al-Malik al-Zahir's faith so Saladin's son, to whom he was very close. And if he is set free, he would corrupt every region of the realm wherein he stays. So very harsh terminology. That being said, states could at times benefit from the persuasive power that the Mahdar yielded on public opinion. It's so Mahdar, to give you an example. So this is the example of a Mahdar. So the original has been preserved. It comes from the St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai. It shows how, you know, this here we can see the morphology of a Mahdar. The Mahdar has tripartite structure. It begins with a formulaic sentences that says such and such thereby present test who has given their handwriting at the end testify that, and then we have the body of the Mahdar, this part where, you know, we have the claim that is made, and then at the end we have this the signatories of the persons who are present. So the Mahdar has a very simple form, but it is versatile enough for allowing all sorts of content, and that's why it was made as a sometimes as a strong tool of a state propaganda. It was used in the year 401 of the Hijri or 1012 of the Common Era in some cities of Iraq. So we have the report of a Mahdar that was about the doctrine of Al-Mahdi, Al-Mahdi's son, so the Fatimids of Cairo. Their doctrine was deemed vile, and the claim of their descent from the Shiite Imam Jafar as-Sadiq was considered as pure falsehood. And scholars and notable Shiite families of Baghdad and Qadi apparently have put their attestation underneath the Mahdar. What is important is that this Mahdar was produced to influence the public opinion in an effort to destroy the attraction of Fatimid propaganda for the common people, because it was read out loud on the pulpits in Baghdad and in other cities. So I would say that in a medieval setting, this was as close as the state could get to a political/religious propaganda, to broadcasting it actually. So the Mahdar. What gave actually the name Mahdar means that, you know, persons were hadir, they were present at the time of its writing. And this dual attestation, you know, that they were present and then that they give their signatories, it made it a valid document. So what gave Mahdar its status of a valid document was the special setting during which it was produced. And so the oral attestation, the fact that the oral attestation was transformed into a written form, and that those who have given their attestation could be brought back in the courts of law and then say if they really were present or they really testified to the claim, made the Mahdar such a powerful tool. And we have, you know, in the story of the quarrel between Abu Bakr Mamshad and the Qadi Abu al-Ala, when during the adjudication, those who testify, who have written their name underneath the Mahdar, they were brought in and they were asked if they really believed that, for example, Qadi Ala was an apostate, or if Abu Bakr Mamshad was an anthropomorphist, something like that. And because the document was forged, then Abu Bakr Mamshad said that, you know, let's reconcile and not pursue this claim. So we have a hint. This is so actually the middle part of the matter, the body of the matter, is where it gets very very detailed. So in the story of Ain al-Qudat, for example, al-Hamadani, we have this is how the matter about him was composed. We read that it is Abu Bakr as-Sam'ani, Abu Sa'd as-Sam'ani, who gave the example of how the matter was written about him. So the vizier, a Saljuqid vizier, who aimed at seizing him, wrote a matter against him. The vizier collected from the middle of al-Hamadani's writing some abominable words that repelled the ears, and needed in their written form the reference to the one who uttered them. So a group of scholars gave their signature on the permissibility of al-Hamadani's blood. And because al-Hamadani left an epistle in which he wrote, what were the accusations, we know exactly what were these abominable words that aroused the scholar, the Qadid and the scholars' wrath. So mahthar were not always used to accuse and condemn. We have also examples of mahthar that were written in defense of a person. The very famous mahthar in defense of a person is the one that Ibn Asakir in his Tabi'in Kazb al-Muftari reproduced in its entirety about the fitna of Ibn al-Qushayri. So al-Qushayri, the son of al-Qushayri, came into Baghdad. He gave a sermon in which he vilified the Baghdadi Hanabila. They were very upset by it. They went on to there was a strife, and so Ibn al-Qushayri was in a huge trouble. At that point, the seven highly positioned scholars of Baghdad, on the head of whom was the head of the Nizamiya Madrasa, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, they wrote a mahthar to in defense of Ibn al-Qushayri to Nizam al-Mulk, who was at the time in Khorasan, and so they defended Ibn al-Qushayri, and they asked Nizam al-Mulk to interfere and to put the Hanabila in their place. So this is about one legal aspect mechanism of apostasy that I think was misunderstood in our studies, in contemporary studies. I have already hinted at how post-Mihna historians created the two prototypes of apostate and martyr. The historians' use of one or two prototypes in the account that they gave of a scholar betrayed, in fact, the viewpoint that they had adopted beforehand. So if we see, for example, a historian uses the terminology of martyrdom, qutla or qutla zulman, this we have a lot, that such and such was killed unjustly when the person was executed, had a proper trial, or if we have this the epithet unjustly zulman, used a lot. So if we see the use of this terminology, it means, in my understanding, it means that the medieval historians trying to build the image of a martyr out of an apostate, and they could use it. It means that in this binary opposition of a state versus scholar, the medieval historian has taken the side of the scholar. If we see the terminology of apostasy build up in our stories, in our narrative sources, then it means that the medieval historian has taken a side with the state. To give you an example, in the narrative sources about the case of Ain al-Qudat al-Hamadani's apostasy, we have three independent narratives about how he was accused of apostasy and how he died. The first narrative was written by a bureaucrat of the Seljuk dynasty, a man called Anushirawan ibn Khalid al-Kashani. And his narrative was reported by Imaduddin al-Isfahani, who was a famous Arabic writer, but he was also related to Ayn al-Qudat, and I get to it later. The second narrative was by Abu Sa'd as-Sam'ani, the author of Al-Ansab. He actually, because he composed such a strong narrative out of this case of apostasy that we see it everywhere. This is what I call the mega narrative. And the third narrative comes from Zahiruddin al-Bayhaqi, an author from Khurasan. The three narratives actually converge in building up the image of a martyr out of the personality of Ayn al-Qudat. This is not the case actually for Sohrawardi. Sohrawardi, in the case of Sohrawardi, the historiographical sources are much more diverse, and the first narrative comes from Ibn Shaddad, who was a bureaucrat in the service of Saladin. So the way that he describes Sohrawardi's case of apostasy leaves no doubt that for him he was an apostate. He was a harmful element of the society that should be eliminated, and it was eliminated by Saladin as the head of the state. Here he doesn't have any qualm in using the word Zandiq in reference to him. We see also Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, who takes up this narrative, and again considers Sohrawardi an apostate. And both Ibn Shaddad and Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, they were active during the time of Ayyubid rule, and so they took a side with the state. But Ibn Abi Usayba, who was a historian, who was a physician, but he didn't had solid ties with the Ayyubids. He took the side of Sohrawardi, the scholar, and therefore we see the narrative of martyrdom build up in his book. And this is also what we see in another source about Sohrawardi's case of apostasy, a certain al-Isfahani who wrote about him. So to say that there were a few elements that they used. First, it was the terminology that they used, whether they referred to the scholar as Zandiq, Mulhid, Kafir, or they abstained from doing so. This is very telling. There was, the way they arranged anecdotes. Ibn Abi Usayba, for example, has 4 or 5 anecdotes about how genius and how particular Sohrawardi was, and how talented he was. And for the case of for Ayn al-Qudat, we have a very dramatic scene where Ibn Sam'ani quotes someone who apparently was present at the scene of the execution. We have a dramatic description where Ayn al-Qudat marched towards the gibbet, and while he was marching, he recites verses of the Quran, and this whole the terminology, the anecdotes, and then the whole build-up of the narrative determines whether they saw the apostate as a martyr as an apostate. So to briefly conclude, I would say that what I saw in studying different cases of scholarly apostasy or notables apostasy, there was a very standard juridical procedure that was put into practice. The state was involved, otherwise we only have the accusations, and accusations could remain just accusations. When there was, when the accusations meant to led to trial, it means that there was some agglomeration of some forces that there were the whole doctrines and politics and social standing of a person then were accounted for in this process. So I wouldn't say that there was just one element. A person was accused because of such and such doctrine, but it is sure that the doctrines were what ignited the accusations in the first place. So yeah, that's it, I think. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Salimeh. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Would you like to start, Christian?
Sure. Do you want me to? I would stop to share.
Yes, please. Thanks.
I'm happy to start if that would
yes,
be.
Yes, please do.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Salimeh. I learned a huge amount. I confess I knew relatively little about Ain al-Qudat al-Hamadani and Suhrawardi and their lives as exemplifying these bigger themes of apostasy and martyrdom. And I found it immensely interesting as someone who is also interested in apostasy and martyrdom, accusations of heresy, albeit in a very, very different context. So thank you. I learned a huge amount. My comments amount to a series of questions. And so feel free, we have limited time, so feel free to address as much or as many or as few of these as you see fit. So the first thing that struck me, and again, this reflects my ignorance about the general situation, but you didn't tell us very much about the basic reasons why these people ran afoul of the authorities. So I would be very interested for the laymen and laywomen in the group in which I place myself, if you could just lay out the basics of what happened in these cases. So you told us a lot about the legal architecture, the theory surrounding what is apostasy and martyrdom, but it would be good to just get the basics. What is going on here? My second question is, to what extent was the apostasy of scholars common at all? So this is something that I have asked with respect to the martyrs and apostates I have worked on, namely Christian apostates and martyrs of the early Islamic period. Are these people the rule? Are they emblematic of wider trends in society, or are they exceptions to the rule? And it is because they are exceptional that they register so powerfully in the historical sources. So that's my second question. Was the apostasy of scholars common at all? My next question kind of dovetails on one of the major themes of your presentation, which is the legal architecture surrounding these episodes. You used two words extremely freely throughout your presentation. I mean, they basically are the backbone of your presentation, and that is apostasy and martyrdom. And if I could just push you on this, I wonder whether you're using those terms in a modern academic historical sense, or whether you're using them because they come out of the sources themselves. That is to say, when you speak about apostasy and martyrdom, you are referring to concepts from the Islamic legal and theological traditions. You gave us a few glimpses into the sources themselves, but based on what you said, I didn't hear murtad, I didn't hear irtidad, I didn't hear istashhad, I didn't hear shaheed. What I did hear were words like kafir, zindiq, mulhid, which technically speaking are not actually words for an apostate in the strict legal sense of the term. So I ask this not to be pedantic, but rather to push you whether to explain a bit more about how the crimes of these two individuals, Ain al-Qudat al-Hamadani and Suhrawardi, fit within the ways in which kind of unbelief was understood and processed in a legal framework, in a medieval legal context? Are these actually, I mean, to put it as bluntly as possible, are these actually cases of apostasy? Are these actually cases of martyrdom in a manner that would have been intelligible to medieval Muslims? Or are these episodes of apostasy and martyrdom that are intelligible to us, given our modern sensibilities of what those terms mean? And I guess this leads into maybe my broadest question of all, which is, in your view, what is the difference between an apostate or a heretic? I mean, the apostates that I worked on, who by and large fit fairly neatly into the category of murtadun, are people who enter and exit Islam fairly clearly. Okay, I mean, if you read the sources, it's of the early Islamic period, I mean, it's clear that probably the frontiers between Christianity and Islam are a lot blurrier than the sources would have us believe. So maybe people are not entering and exiting in such a clear-cut fashion. But nonetheless, you know, if we take them at face value, these are murtadun in the conventional sense of the term. But what you seem to be describing is not really apostasy. You seem to be describing executions for heresy, which again, if we're going to be precise, seems like a related but a separate legal and theological category. And then very finally, and again, this is a question that jumps out of my own research, I wonder, when you scrutinize the accounts of trial and execution, whether you see legal systems that are by and large hesitant to punish people for heresy and for apostasy, or whether they are enthusiastic in punishing people for holding wrong beliefs. And I ask this because, again, the episodes that I know best from the early centuries of Islamic history, the abiding impression is of a state that really does not want to use this maximum form of pressure to punish people for unbelief. They execute people basically as a last resort. And maybe that's a trope in the sources, but I think that there are good reasons based on the Islamic legal framework as it develops early on to think that the state by and large didn't really want to execute people except as a matter of last resort. So I'd be interested to know, in a late medieval context where we're not talking about Christians and Muslims, but rather we're talking about forms of unbelief within the boundaries of Islam, whether you would also say that the authorities approach these people with hesitancy and caution. So again, these questions, I think, are a reflection of how much your presentation made me think and how much I learned from it. So thank you very much.
Thanks. They're all excellent questions. So, so your first question is, what is going on with these persons? Why they were, if I understand correctly, you mean that I should explain more. You want me to explain more about who were Ain al-Qudat, who were Sohrawardi, and why they were caught up in these affairs? Is this what you mean that I should explain, or? Well,
you know, as I said, I am not a specialist in your period, and I suspect there are many people on the call for whom Ain al-Qudat, al-Hamadani, and Sohrawardi are not everyday names and may not know the circumstances that led to their execution as apostates or infidels. So maybe you could just lay out the basics, and
sure.
then we can talk about some of these other issues.
Sure. So Ain al-Qudat al-Hamadani, he was actually from a strong household of Hamadan. He was born into a family of judges. So he was initially part of the elite, the Hamadani elite. It seems, he identifies himself as a qadi in his writing, but the oldest account, historiographical account that we have on him, only calls him faqih. So this is there's this there's this conundrum that why Abu Sa'd Sam'ani didn't say if Ain al-Qudat was a qadi in Hamadan. Abu Sa'd Samani should definitely say it. Why he didn't say it? This is actually a problem on which I'm working right now. But anyhow, he was part of the Hamadani elite at a time when the Seljuk dynasty was having a very turbulent time. They were, incessant wars between Seljuk princes. So the Seljuk dynasty was becoming fragmented, and he was Ain al-Ghudat, because he was part of the Hamadani elite, because he had close ties with high bureaucrats of the Seljuk. He was related to a person who was one of the head of the divan of the Seljuk Sultan, a man called Azizuddin al-Mustafi. So he was a part of this faction, this political faction. That they were caught in this rivalries between other political factions. It is very possible that this influenced, this case, this trial, that because he was related to this guy who was also, in prison for political rivalry, he also suffered the consequences. But it's not the only reason why Ain al-Ghudat was considered to be apostate by other scholars, because he's a very, he's such a gadfly. He was, it seems that because he was very young, because he was talented, he was somehow trying to attract controversy. This is something that he tells himself in his writing, and it seems that the way that he used, for example, Avicennan philosophy. So he preached Avicenna's doctrines of prophethood from the pulpits. This is something that apparently has attracted some critiques from the people, because it is a very detailed doctrine that if you summarize it, it can become controversial, or it can be it can be very it can have some problematic implications. So he was someone he was a notable of Hamadan. He had close ties with the political elite, and he was and also military, because he also mentions others, person with military titles, and he was also he had quite strange ideas too. Sohrawardi, by contrast, he wasn't initially a notable of Aleppo. He came, he traveled a lot. At the end of his life, he came, when he was 30 something, he came into Al-Malik al-Zahir's, the Saladin's son's courts. He became very close to him. Apparently this caused some jealousy, because probably he was, receiving the favor of Saladin's son, and therefore, and he was also he had also some innovative ideas about philosophy, about principles of about philosophical principles. But this is, the way that, they are framed. What I say, it's the account that I get from the biographical dictionaries, and the way they crafted their stories. We do not know much about actually Ain al-Ghudat, more than, just the few words that I said, partly because the historiographical tradition of the Seljuk period is very poor. We have not much sources about them. It is not the case with Sohrawardi, but nonetheless, what we have in Sohrawardi's case is very, very stereotyped understanding of the person that was Sohrawardi. So I don't know if I can answer, if I did answer your question.
Sorry, I don't mean to derail you too much, but having the basics is helpful. Thanks.
Sure. And how common was this, your second question, how common was a scholarly apostasy or apostasy in general? Well, it depended a lot on the period, and it depended a lot on the, the type of dynasty that was ruling, whether they were willing to push for some religious orthodoxy or not. So it really depended on a lot of factors. We see, for example, in the beginning of the on the 12th century, 6th century of Hijra, during the time when Ayn was executed, we see that there's this surge of, political killing. Actually, political killing of qadis is there were. I enumerated them in my work. There are a whole total of 20-something qadis, for example, and other scholars who were killed during this period. So when there was in different cities of the Seljuk era. So when there was, then there was political turbulence, when there were rivalry between the Cairo and Baghdad, the accusations could arise, and they could also amount to trials, but they didn't all the time amount to executions or other punishments. A famous case, for example, is Ibn Aqil, who was a Hanbali qadi in Baghdad. He was, he also had a famous case. He was accused of apostasy because of some beliefs, but and he was under house arrest. He had to go into hiding, but he didn't actually end up being executed. He was saved after his accuser died, and but, or for example, there are other, it depended. So the fact that they could, the rivalry between the Cairo and Baghdad could, whether the caliphs wanted to push the anti-Ismaili agenda, this could affect a lot of, this scholarly apostasy cases. We have it at the time of the Abbasid Caliph Al-Qadir, who was very zealot in matters of, Sunni orthodoxy. We see that also a surge of these kinds of accusations because he wanted to push forward a certain kind of understanding about the what is the Muslim orthodoxy. Other than that, the accusations were always there, but the fact that some of the accusations led to trials, and then the trials led to executions, was something that was, I would say, rare. So it didn't happen all the time. Your third question was, how much of this apostasy martyrdom is based on our academic understanding? How much of it is comes from the medieval sources? Well, it is a mix of both, I would say, what I say about apostasy, because the vocabulary of irtidat is never used. What they see, in the harshest case is the word halal ad-dam. So that can appear. So someone is called halal ad-dam, meaning that his blood can be spilled. But they never, the medieval historians never use irtidat in reference to a scholar. I never saw that. So, which in my opinion, actually confirms, affirms my point that, they were hesitant to use the vocabulary of apostasy in reference to scholars. They didn't want to use that. Shaheed actually appears in the case of political killing, when factions, when Shafis and Hanafis were in conflict with each other and they killed each other. The person who was killed, and this happens a lot, for example, Ayn Qudat's grandfather was killed by some, you know, factionism, or by some fanatics. He was called the Shaheed, but never in the case of a person who was accused of apostasy, who went into trial. Never I saw the word Shaheed in reference to them. What I saw is that qutila zulman, you know, he was murdered unjustly. The person never is called a Shaheed. So what I say is, so in the case of martyrdom, you know, it's a bit of a stretch that I use the martyrdom, because, you know, they went as far as using unjust killing, but not being, you know, martyr, being but not the vocabulary of shahada or killing. They didn't use that. So it's
sorry to interrupt. I mean, what you just said is very interesting, and it makes me wonder whether you have any reservations about using apostasy and martyrdom with respect to these case studies as much as you do, given that those are not terms that come out of the sources themselves. They're not technically apostates based on what you have said.
But well, they are, because, you know, they had the trial, they were convicted, and then they were killed. I would say that, you know, I'll take the part of the estate. So in the eyes of the estate, they were apostate. That's why they're killing. It was legitimized. This was not something that, you know, because we have the cases, numerous cases of, you know, individual killing each others for some religious or factional reasons. This we have a lot, but the estate, you know, as much as we would want them to be medieval, they didn't do that. So when the person had a trial, had a hearing, was convicted, was brought, you know, into being gibbeted, he was an apostate. I don't see why we cannot use the term in reference to, for example, even if, you know, from a moral standpoint, I wouldn't use the term. But if I want to say that as historians, we want to get back to these stories and say what happened, they were considered as apostates. They were not, you know.
That's very interesting, and actually raises the question of the use of irtidad in the classical literature. I mean, I think it would be interesting to check whether, I mean, what uses have been made of this technical term that we translate as apostasy, and why wasn't it used in the cases that you're studying? Why is there this tutor in the use of the terms, but not in the actual consequences, which is the execution?
I think because, you know, yeah, exactly. I think because, you know, the historian, let's say Khatib al-Baghdadi, who writes, you know, the story about Bishr al-Marisi or about al-Khuzai, so he's you know, he's imposing meaning by telling this story. And he doesn't want to say that in his eyes, al-Khuzai, who was executed by the caliph himself, is not considered as apostate. So the fact that he doesn't use the vocabulary of irtidad, in my opinion, is telling a lot that you know, they didn't approve. So they take a moral stance on these cases. They don't want, so we never see if we don't see the vocabulary of irtidad being used in historical sources, narrative sources, whereas, for example, we can see them in documentary sources. We can see them in the examples of the document in the Shah collections, for example, that we have. Yeah, we see the word murtad appear, but not in narrative sources like Tarikh Baghdad, like, you know, all the biographical dictionaries in which we have accounts of these scholars. So in my understanding, because they're taking a moral stance, they don't want to. But this is not always the case. For example, Ain al-Qudat, in one of the narratives about Ain al-Qudat, the one that is told by Sam'ani, a few generations later, it is taken up by Az-Zahabi, who was a very zealot Shafi'ite. And Az-Zahabi, actually, he doesn't agree with As-Sam'ani, and he says, you know, in very blunt terms, that this I read some pages of this mulhid, and these are all wild doctrines in the manner of the philosopher and botany. So he's, it depends on the moral stance of the historian. But even, I would say that even Zahabi didn't say murhid. I think he used mulhid, not murtad. Yeah. Did I answer, Christian? So, and yes, but as I said, so we have a lot, what they say is halalatam. Halalatam appears a lot in narrative sources.
We don't have very much time left, but please, just if you...
Sure, were the states hesitant to punish? Yes, they were hesitant. So what we see, for example, if I want to give an example from the Seljuk period, we have, for example, a Qadi of Isfahan, a very influential person in the name of Khatibi, who took down his enemies by accusing them of apostasy, and but the Seljuk Sultan, who was ruling at the time, he didn't want to approve of his doing such. So it was the states or the ruling authorities, they were really hesitant in pushing into punishment people, especially if there was people persons in questions were had high positions, like being a body or being coming from a notable family or things like that.
Was there? I think that you answered all of Christian's questions.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. I had we have a few more minutes for, I think, one last question. Well, before my question, someone in the audience asked whether it was possible to access your dissertation. So
yes, it's accessible online.
Yeah, I posted the link.
Yeah, but the stuff that I'm telling now is not in my dissertation. So my dissertation is about the intellectual history, not about the apostasy case.
Great. So my question is, well, as advertised by your title, you mainly focused on juridical and historical aspects.
I wish I could go more into how these narratives are built, which is very interesting. But yeah.
So yeah, my question was about these narratives and these two categories of martyrdom and apostasy, and I was wondering to what extent we can say that these narratives of martyrdom on one side and apostasy on the other both concur actually in occulting the political implications of what's happening. So you mentioned that Al-Hamadani, for instance, was caught into conflicts occurring at the time. So to what extent these narratives are trying to take the matter on a religious or intellectual ground rather than to occult the political aspect?
This is a very good question, actually. It is actually what they are doing. What we see, especially in the genre of biographical dictionary, which is something that the scholars used a lot to tell their stories. So the tabaqat genre. So the way that the tabaqat genre framed the social presence of scholars is especially, is very peculiar, because they tried all to present these people as someone who had no political interest, who didn't play, who didn't have any role. Even, a person like a Qadi, who's, he's one of the, leading figures in the political in the politics of a city, even, you know, a qadi is represented just like a pious person, or who stayed, you know, who led a pious life and things like that. So the general tendency, especially in biographical dictionaries, is to say that these people, they had very little to do with politics. You know, and this is very telling, because when we read, for example, about Ain al-Qudat and about as-Suhrawardi, they are presented as victims, okay, victims of personal rivalries. But if, for example, if Ain al-Qudat was a qadi, which I think he was, because otherwise he wouldn't identify himself as a qadi. If he was a qadi in Hamadan, it means that he had, you know, he had a huge political role to play, and he was probably very wealthy. Actually, he was probably very, very rich, coming from a powerful household, and having the function of the qadiship. It means that he was a very rich person, and it could actually, the fact that someone was wealthy could also become an incentive in taking down a person, because what happened in apostasy in these trials is that they confiscated the person's properties. And so this could be actually, you know, when I was thinking about, so why, if, you know, if these people, you know, those who accused as-Suhrawardi or al-Hamadani of apostasy, if they were only driven by religious zeal, they would kill him, you know, because it was all this happens all the time, especially during the time when Ain al-Qudat was living. You know, we have lots and lots of cases of killing. But the fact that they took him into trial means that they confiscated his property. It means that probably he was very rich, and probably he was a person who was very highly implicated in the politics of his time, as we know from the relationship that he maintained with other powerful persons of the Seljuk, in the Seljuk court. But we don't see it in our narrative sources, especially in the genre of biographical dictionary, which remain all silent about, you know, the social and religious role that people played in their time.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because this shows somehow that there's a trend of depoliticizing
exactly
revolts and these kinds of things. I mean,
exactly.
for example, in the case of Suhrawardi, some sources, I don't know to what extent they may be true, but some sources seem to indicate that he had political ambitions, and even that he may have he may have been involved in an armed rebellion, but nothing
Very
appears from.
Very
I mean,
interesting.
This is I take this from, you know, Shams Tabrizi in his Maqalat. So I think this is what I understand from this passage, but there might be other interpretations. But this reminds me of what happened in the historiographical sources regarding Abu al-Khattab, who was a disciple of Ja'far Sadiq, Imam. And so these sources never mentioned that Abu al-Khattab led a revolt, but it appears from what they say. They just say that he had, you know, an exaggerating doctrine, and he believed in transmigration and divinized the Imam and so on. But and they say that he was killed with his partisans in the mosque in Kufa. But why was he there in this mosque with his partisans gathered with him? But the sources, you know.
This is very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, the sources, the way that they crafted their meaning is to say that, you know, these persons were just individuals with very exceptional characteristics, and they had nothing to do with it. And they didn't have dirty hands. Yes. Which I think they had.
Absolutely. Well, I think this will conclude our session today. Thank you very much, Salimeh, for this wonderful presentation. And thank you, Christian, for agreeing to join us today. This session concludes the first half of our series this year, which will resume after the summer break, and then we will have 3 more lectures by the end of the year. One of them will be delivered by Christian Sander. So the information on these lectures will be uploaded shortly on the IAS website, along with the registration links. Thank you for attending,
Thank you.
presenting Salimeh once again. And,
Thanks.
see
Thanks for
you,
inviting me.
in September.
Sure.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.